So we're back with our Flame Premium presentation, the second part, which we're going to concentrate more on Flame.
That's right. Now, we called this series of videos Something for Everyone because we're talking about how bringing editorial finishing, 3D visual effects, and real-time color grading is really what Flame Premium is all about. And in this section, we're going to concentrate a little bit more on those Flame tools, and these are tools that are great regardless of which workflow you're working in. But you'll notice we've also kept Lustre highlighted there because we're also going to address the issue of real-time grading. And in this case, we're not going to actually do any grading right away, but we're going to think about grading as we work through our timeline.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea.
Okay, now one of the key concepts here behind Flame Premium, I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but it's thinking about the convergence that's happening in finishing. And what you're seeing is a lot of projects maybe with smaller budgets. You're seeing finishing artists that are doing a lot of things like color grading in the finishing suite, whether they're using color grading tools or tools like the Color Warper that are already there. You're also seeing clients that they want one-stop shopping, and let's be honest, people that are using Flame today, they're some of the best artists out there. Right? So that's really what the convergence is all about, bringing these tools together. But when we decided to create this solution, we really wanted to concentrate on the simplicity of it. So Bill's going to show a couple of examples of how there's really just one project. If you archive a Flame Premium project, it's one archive for the color grading information as well as for the VFX information. So really, the timeline becomes that key back and forth, and one artist can actually tackle an entire post-production job, including the color grading part. So it really gives you total control in finishing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good message to get out.
So let's start with the first section, which is pretty easy. It's the simplified project management. Now, how does that work?
Okay, so we've launched into Flame in Flame Premium, so you can see the splash screen here. And we're going to take a look at this project. Now, before we actually go in and play the final, I wanted to mention on the shared project side the benefit of when you do a project creation in either Flame or Smoke, you now are presented with the option to also create a project for Lustre.
And this is what I was talking about with simplified project management, because you don't want to have to be worrying when you're in the suite. When maybe you've got a client behind you, maybe you're just working against a deadline. The last thing you want to be doing is saying, now where did that media render and what's my path and how does that go? So this, as you'll see when we go through the demo and get into the color grading part in one of the later videos, this simplifies that whole process.
Yeah, you don't even have to think about it. It's great. And again, when you archive, that one archive is available for all three software. And you can choose to work on the Lustre side. Your settings can be set automatically to linear or into a logarithmic color space, and also you can choose to work in stereoscopy.
Yeah, and thinking about stereoscopic, we're not actually doing stereoscopic work in this project, but a stereoscopic workflow with Flame Premium is pretty impressive because you've got real-time stereoscopic 3D color grading all the way through visual effects.
So we've got this great project from the Mill in London, and it was done for Guinness, and we'll go ahead and play down this final, and then we'll come back and take you through some more of the timeline workflow.
It's time to bring this place to life.
So that's just a great commercial.
Great looking spot. Now I think the place you were going to start here, we're going to kind of ease into the Flame workflow. And you wanted to start by talking about the timeline because this is the same timeline we saw in the previous video.
Exactly, and what we're going to look at are some specific shots. We've got some CG that's been included with our live action, so we've got some CG birds here, and we also, just to kind of point it out, there also was CG, some CG fish as well that were integrated into some of these scenes, and really just wanted to talk about 3D finishing in general. But before we do that, let's go into batch, and we'll bring our start timelines. We have sort of a work in progress timeline here. We're going to navigate down to one of the stacks that we see, some of the vertical segments within our timeline, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the basic editing and basic compositing that went into to putting some of those shots together. So here, for example, we've got our original live action backplate. And the intention of this particular scene was to have the catapult pulling up the trees, and the scale of the catapult that was originally used just wasn't grand enough. So what they went ahead and did is shot a close-up of that catapult to then and then put that on a layer above the original backplate to then be cut out and recomposited over the original scene. And of course, we've also got a very large 4K sky element that we're going to composite in the background as well. So we've got these three layers that need to be composited together in our timeline. The great thing about working inside of the timeline within Flame or Smoke is you have the option to work in different ways and apply the tools that are required, in different approaches. So the first one we're going to look at for the live action backplate to do the cleanup is using pre-compositing or nested compositing within the timeline. So notice when I step into a pre, I'm presented with all the various tools that we have in batch. So these are all of the creative and technical tools are available. We've also gone from the overall complete timeline just to that one segment that we want to concentrate on. So we have an isolated version of that timeline now, and we can start to bring in the tools required. The first thing we'll start with is the Auto Stabilize node. And the reason we want to start with the Auto Stabilize node is because it actually has, this shot has a little bit of a gate weave in it. So we want to remove that using the stabilization tool, and we'll just switch to a perspective, planar perspective analysis of that. And you can see right away when we switch to the result, you can see that we're now removing the movement automatically. So Flames automatically analyzed the movement and negated that. There's a bit of a roll there in the top of our shot, so we can just mirror that image to clean that up. The next stage will be to remove the actual catapult. So we'll go back to the tools and bring out the paint node. We'll drop the paint node into the procedure, and now of course we can start to paint on the image.
What's cool about this batch paint node is it's applied sort of over top of the whole clip, right? So it's in other words, you're not committing your stroke on a single frame, right?
That's right, and you can actually replace imagery underneath the strokes if need be.
So this is really interesting. If you were going to grade this shot later and you did some paint changes on it, in theory, depending on what you did here, those paint changes could even show up.
Yeah, and in fact, we're going to show that by the end of the presentation. So what we'll do now is just do some basic cleanup. Just kind of recursive clone tool here to clone over sections of our background to cover the area that we want to remove. And that's working pretty well, and you can see as I scrub through now, we've got that applied to the entire sequence. There are also some areas where there was a little bit of dirt in the gate, so we can clean that up. And now we've got our clean plate, and you can see we've kept the actors running away from the catapult. When we exit back out of the procedure in a pre-batch composite, that gets sent back to the timeline for that particular segment. Notice that as I scrub through the timeline, if I'm parked on any individual frame that needs to be rendered, the software will just render it for me. You can see that the dotted line has become a solid line just by scrubbing through. It says why not render that frame while you're parked on it, but of course if I need to actually see it in real time, I could go ahead and choose to render any of the segments or the overall timeline, all of the effects if need be, and now I can scrub through and play that back in real time. Now, continuing on with our replacement of that catapult, you can see we've got this one frame, the still frame that we want to cut out. And to do that, we'll use something called a soft effect. And soft effects are great. They're available directly in the timeline. So if we zoom out a little bit, notice if I go in and start to scale this element down, you can see that I'm really able to apply a basic picture-in-picture effect here right in the timeline. So what we want to do here is actually cut that out using a garbage mask. So we'll enter into the axis effect where we have more tools available, and into the keyer. And we're not going to try to key this out. Instead, we're going to cut it out using a garbage mask. So the garbage masking tools within Flame and Smoke are very powerful. And you can see I can quickly go in and just outline any of the elements that I'm trying to isolate. And if I just bring the color down, you can see now I've cut that out. In the interest of time, of course, I'm just going to quickly replace that with the finished cutout version. You can see a lot more work went into this. A lot more individual elements were used to cut out the catapult. And when we step back out of the keyer now we can go in and start to replace that into our timeline. So we're just going to move it up, slide it over, maybe scale it down a bit. Let's make it pretty small, and then again we've now replaced that over the original painted and removed catapult. Now we have a much grander size catapult. Now it's really looking a little bit stamped on here, so some of the things that we can do to make that integrate a bit better would be things like shadows. If we move in and put a shadow effect here, I'm just going to move the position for the rotation down so we can kind of lay that down in our scene, maybe shear it a bit, kind of choose the angle of the sun. We can also blur it, and of course adjust the transparency so we can get something that looks a little bit more subtle in our scene, right? So maybe something a little bit more like that. And then at this point, when I exit back out of the axis soft effect, we see again, if we kind of do a review, we've got our cleaned up plate, and now our axis effect on top where we've cut out the still frame of the catapult. And finally we want to add our large sky replacement background. So we'll again use a soft effect, an axis soft effect for this. Again, you can see the HD frame as it compares to the overall 4K frame that we're bringing in for the background sky. I'll rotate that around. We could also rotate this forward to create a little bit more perspective. And if I move this up, you can see that what we're really trying to do is put it up in the sky, the replacement sky, where the original sky was really flat. And so to do that a bit better, we'll enter the keyer again. And of course, this time we're going to cut out just the sky portion of the still frame. So we'll just lay down some points.
So, and a lot of these tools, these are not things that are new or exclusive to Flame Premium, but I think it really underscores how the convergence is happening, not just with color grading and visual effects, but really between a timeline workflow and a traditional VFX workflow, and how there are a lot of different options for artists to work here.
Yeah, and even things like advanced edge gradients. It's not new, but these are really the essential tools to do all of your compositing. I mean, your basic A over B compositing would never be complete without this type of tool set. So let's go back out to our work in progress scene here. We've got our sky replacement element. The only thing that's actually a problem now is the organization of the layers as they sit in the timeline. We've got the catapult, actually the sky being placed over the catapult, and that's not going to work. So this is again the advantage of working in a timeline, vertical timeline compositing workflow. I'm going to use the snap to positioner tool and pick up and reorder the layers here by just saying let's put the catapult now on top of the sky, and we can clean that up right away. So I think that's a good example of a really straightforward composite that you can do all in the timeline.
Okay, so that's great. That's really our first example, and then you've got another example that actually starts out in the timeline, but gets a little bit more advanced.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to show, is kind of compare and contrast the different workflows. So what we've got here is what we're going to call the 3D finishing, 3D compositing finishing workflow using OpenEXR. So what we have is some CG birds. So when they shot this originally, if we move to the layer below, you can see that our background layer, there's a few birds that come out of this basket, but they actually wanted a lot more birds, so they created these using Maya. You can see they're actually starting from the same origin point, so they're actually CG birds. They're just very well done. And if you look at the color coding now for this particular element, it's a CG element with an embedded mat. So it's actually placed into the timeline as a container. And if we double click on that, you can see we can step inside the container where we see the front of that element, and then if we toggle to the track below, you can see there's the mat for that. So we're able to work with containers in the timeline as well. So with these two elements, I want to composite them together, but I'm going to take them into a more advanced compositing area in a post-batch effect. So you notice as soon as I select two elements in the timeline, I'm presented with the post-batch effects option. So we'll move into a post-batch effects and contrast that with the pre-batch effect. And you can see that the order of those layers is maintained, and then I've got access again to all of the tools within batch, and a very nice automatic way of starting into my action compositing is to just split and convert the timeline elements into a batch tree. So that's nice that that option exists as an automatic sort of starting point.
So now you've got the base layers built in, right? So the timeline in this case is a nice organizational tool,
right?
But when you really want to get into some heavy-duty compositing, you're going to want to get into action, but you're not forced to abandon that whole timeline workflow. The relationship is
yeah,
there.
exactly. There's a nice handoff between the timeline and then the 3D compositing environment. Now, to kind of step ahead in the interest of time, I'm just going to move into a little bit further advanced scene, a batch scene that we've been working on. You can see here's the original plate. You can even see the edges of the film when it was scanned. We see different stages of development. We see the resize of the plate into our HD space. We've got garbage masks here, logic ops to combine those together. And then we've got just a white frame, and we're going to use this white frame as basically a card in our 3D compositing scene. So we're going to go into action now, and let's have a look in the schematic view at what's going on here. So we've got just two lights in our scene. Again, these lights are actually going to be exclusive to the background, which is just that white card, and then we have a foreground general light as well, and that's going to be able to light the other elements in the foreground. So what we're going to do with this card is actually use a very nice tool, a procedural texture generator in the Maps section of Action, what's called Substance Texture. And when I double click on that, I'm brought into a series, really a library of textures here in different categories. So you can see we have...
Now these all come with Flame Premium, and this is a really interesting way to go through and add photorealistic textures into a scene, right? So kind of creating something from nothing.
Exactly. That's why we just started with a white card. And what's really interesting about these textures is that they are very photorealistic. They're also tileable. So if I need to create sort of an infinite tile, I can do that. Let's go ahead and bring the intensity up a bit so we can see this better. And take this light and start to move it around. And they also react as if they were 3D. So you can see that we've got like a very 3D look and feel to these substance textures. Well, that's because we're using these various maps that are now available inside of Action to generate these. So we're using normal maps and parallax maps to create this kind of effect.
Now, I think what's really interesting here is this is a great example of how you're taking sort of 3D composites, whether they're normal maps or the parallax map or the specular map, and you're bringing them into a 2D compositing environment. And what's great is how interactive this remains, because you're kind of doing a cheat.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you notice that the speed, the interactivity is maintained, because what we're using are techniques that are generally used in game engines. We're doing all this on the graphics card, on the graphics processing unit. Notice if I move the flat white card on its side, you can see it's completely flat. Right?
So there's no geometry involved. So there's zero processing overhead that you would associate with all of these different geometric shapes or the lighting details or things like this.
Exactly. So this is how we're able to maintain this kind of performance and this type of experience on the Flame side. This is sort of a good starting point to give you the idea of what a substance texture generator can do, but of course let's put this into a more realistic context. So we're going to go and change the preset now, and if we look in the environments category, there's a sky, right? So that's more appropriate for what we're trying to do here. And I also think that this really speaks to how you can control and create just just from a white frame, something that looks, you know, like a very interesting look development here for this particular scene. So if we go back to our substance, texture, materials, we could do things like adjust the number of clouds in the sky. You can see we can have just a little wispy cloud. We can have a lot of really cloudy day. We can go into the basics menu. We can apply, you know, more saturation and create a much bluer sky here. If we go back to the materials, we can start to move the clouds by adjusting their shape. Of course, all this can be animated. And if we adjust the time of day, I really like this. If we just take the time of day down, you can see as we go all the way down that the stars actually start to come out at night. And if we change the intensity of this of the light, you can see we can even create a kind of a day for night look there.
So this is really powerful. I mean, always check, you know, if you're looking for a preset or you need to add clouds or a texture or something, always go to your substance textures first, because again, they're designed for this very purpose, and a very low overhead on the processing.
Yeah, and they're just amazing. So if we go back to our clouds, let's make it a little bit cloudier for this example, and let's go ahead and take a look at the other light. So we've got another light here. Remember that these are also high dynamic range images, so that as you adjust the lights, you will be able to change the exposure of these substance texture generators as well. And if we look at this this general light that we're actually applying here on the rocks that the guy's standing on. So what's interesting here is if we come over and hide that element, you can see that the original rocks were replaced with CG rocks. And that's kind of an interesting idea, because when you're rendering CG rocks like this, you could actually render them as OpenEXR elements and then embed into the OpenEXR file format some extra metadata in the form of, in this case, a normals map. So if we look at the normal map, it's kind of a strange looking image, but inside of here is all the lighting information that was appropriately done in the 3D application. So in this case in Maya, they rendered out OpenEXR pass. We're bringing that into action now, and we can now apply that as a normal map in our scene. And when I add that into the scene, just by attaching the normal map to that image, that OpenEXR image, you can see how the lighting has really changed, or the reaction of the light to that surface has really changed. Again, this is a flat 2D rendered element, but it has all the properties of a 3D element because of the metadata embedded in the normal map. So I think that's really interesting, and if we were to really exaggerate that by going back to the image and adjusting something like the shine, you can really see the bumpiness of that surface is coming through because we've got that normal map applied. So let's start to pull back a bit. We're going to bring that light back a bit in our scene, kind of start to highlight other things, maybe increase the intensity a bit. We want to take our scene into more of a three-dimensional environment, so we're going to go back to one of these surfaces and change it from a flat surface into a bicubic surface. That's going to give us these handles that we can start to bend around. So we'll select these points, start to pull them back in 3D space, and create a much more parallax in our scene. We need to also change sort the layers a little bit better. And now one other thing that we might want to do would be to add just a light as a creative tool. So the lights themselves, because these substance textures are high dynamic range images, we can start to play around with things like the spread of the light, adjust the fall off of the light, maybe move this back a bit. We can even pick it up on screen and move it where maybe we want to create sort of a hazy sort of effect there in our clouds in the background. And also maybe affect a bit of the mountains in the foreground. Just by adjusting the intensity of the light, we can kind of blow that out a bit. And now we're going to switch to another view of our scene through what we call the working camera. And this is a great way of kind of looking at your scene from another camera's point of view. There we see the rendered camera that we're going to be rendering through, and then of course we can move all around the scene to kind of get a really good bird's eye view of everything that's going on in 3D space. So with that, what we'll do is send that result back to our timeline, and then we'll be able to go ahead and render that. And you can see that all the two elements, the two layers in the timeline, have been collapsed down to this one element now in our timeline.
Okay, so that's great. So we've seen a couple of different workflows using the timeline, and when we come back, we'll look at some more advanced compositing.
Exactly.